Hello everybody, welcome back to Out of Body's 31 Days of October. So in today's Haunted Memphis episode, I'm going to be talking about Elmwood Cemetery, the oldest active cemetery in Memphis. So if you'd like to hear more about that, keep watching. So like I said, Elmwood Cemetery is actually the oldest active cemetery in Memphis. It was founded back in 1852. It was also one of the first rural, if I can say that word, garden type cemeteries in the South. So it was during this time, around the Victorian era, where people were building cemeteries that were more, I guess for lack of a better word, attractive. They were more attractive to people to just kind of walk along, kind of like a park. So they started making them more park-like with gardens and kind of like what we know a cemetery to be today, where it has paths and places you can walk and trees and things you can look at, and some of the headstones have like angels and things on them. You know, it just makes it more appealing. So that was what was happening during this time. About 50 wealthy Memphians at the time decided to pitch in their money and build this cemetery. So currently the cemetery holds around 75,000 people, which is quite a lot. Supposedly I think there's still room for about 20,000 people. So it's not quite filled up yet. I don't know if you guys could hear, but there's rain outside, so this is like perfect for the spooky atmosphere. Anyway, of those 75,000 people, there's many veterans that are buried there, starting from the Revolutionary War on up to present day veterans. There's a huge mix of different kinds of people buried there. Apparently there are not only veterans, but political leaders, martyrs, madames, spies, outlaws, and even murderers. And as it says in this Haunted Memphis book, and also I believe on Elmwood Cemetery's website it says this, I think, don't quote me on that, it says basically people who never associated with each other during their life are buried next to each other in death. So one thing that's kind of eerie about this cemetery is that there are at least three, I think it's just three, different mass graves there, which if you don't know what that means basically a grave full of remains from people that are unknown. So they didn't know who these people were, or it was like body parts, you know, and remains that they couldn't match up with anyone's identity. So they just put them all together and buried them in this mass grave. So there are three different ones. One of them is a Confederates mass grave, so it's full of Confederate soldiers that they couldn't match up to anyone in particular, and that's very sad. I mean, that's not uncommon in wartime. You know, so many people die all at once, and you know, a lot of people have really bad wounds or limbs blown off and things like that. So a lot of times it's really hard for them to match things up after it's over. And the second mass grave is very sad as well. Not that any of these would be a happy occasion, but the second one is for slaves. So apparently at some point there were a lot of slaves killed. I don't know if it might have been during the Civil War. It didn't really specify on that. I kind of assume it might have been during that time. I don't know. But there is a mass grave full of African American slaves. Once again, very dark time in our history. Very sad, but it is there. And they have a monument over each of these mass graves as well, just honoring the victims who were buried there. The third mass grave is actually full of people who died from the plague. I'm assuming it was the plague of the yellow fever, because I know I read on another website about a lot of yellow fever victims were buried in the cemetery, so I think that mass grave from a plague must have been from the yellow fever that ran through Memphis. So that is the third mass grave. Again, very sad. The first time I ever learned what a mass grave was when I actually went to Europe and visited some concentration camps, and there are many mass graves at many of the concentration camps and different burial grounds for people who died in concentration camps. That's another video I will do another day on that. Let me know if you guys are interested in that. I might talk about that. It's a little bit harder for me to talk about because it was a very heavy experience and very emotional. So I wanted to go over a few people who specifically are buried there that are kind of famous or infamous. One of them is Alma Theed, and apparently she was known as Vance Avenue Alma, which Vance Avenue is one of the streets in Memphis. Apparently she was accused of shooting 3 of her 6 husbands. So she is actually buried there. Another infamous person married there. Another infamous person buried there is Alice Mitchell. Apparently she murdered her lover after they had a failed attempt to run away together and get married. So that's interesting. So as far as haunted activity, I couldn't find a lot online about this. I did find a couple things, and then I'll go over what I found in the Haunted Memphis book, because there's a lot more first-hand accounts of haunted activity in this book. But first I want to go over, I saw someone who reviewed the Elmwood Cemetery. I think it was on like TripAdvisor or something like that. Someone reviewed it, and they said they actually heard moaning while they were there, and they heard their name being called. So that's pretty creepy. Contrary to popular belief, cemeteries typically aren't that haunted. Not as much as, say, a really old house would be, or somewhere where a tragic shooting happened or something like that. The reason being is that most people, when they die, if they do stay earthbound, they tend to linger wherever they spent most of their time when they were alive, or wherever they had a tragic event happened in their life, or wherever their heart was, you know, when they were alive, you know. So a lot of times that's in their home. Or sometimes it's where something tragic happened, you know, or sometimes it's at their favorite place that they would go when they were alive. So a lot of times that's most common. So spirits don't tend to linger around their bodies in the cemetery. It doesn't really make sense when you think about it. The other paranormal thing that happened there to the director of the cemetery, she was in the little cottage that they have on there in the office late at night, and she was the only one there. She confirmed that she was the last person there. She was sitting by a window working in the office, and all of a sudden she heard someone outside by the window whistling a song, like whistling a tune. And she said, like, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and it really freaked her out because she knew she was completely by herself at that cemetery. So that's about all I could find online as far as paranormal activity at the cemetery. Now in this book, Haunted Memphis, which of course this isn't sponsored, but I found this book after I started recording the Voodoo Village I cannot say that word. Voodoo Village video. So anyway, and then I found this book and I was like, oh, I didn't even know there was a book called Haunted Memphis. So anyway, this has more detail about some of the paranormal activity that has been recounted over the years at the cemetery. One of those being one of the caretakers of the cemetery back in the 1980s. When he was closing up the cemetery for the night, he noticed 4 men gathered at this tall hill in the cemetery. I think it's located in the middle of the cemetery, this really tall hill, and that hill is called Linnell Circle. And so he saw these 4 men standing up at the top of that hill, and he noticed that they were cloaked entirely in white with top hats and coattails. And he says as he approached them, he actually started to walk towards them. They didn't walk away, but they glided away. So they started to glide away from him. He said this entire encounter lasted about a minute, and he said it seems that those 4 men didn't even notice that he was there. So apparently these 4 men are now kind of a legend, that they show up every night at midnight. So the 4 men are assumed to be David Haddon, Napoleon Hill, Henry Montgomery, and Archibald Wright. Each of them, of course, buried at that cemetery. And the legend is that they apparently meet at that Linnell Circle every night at midnight. And what is interesting about that, as to maybe why they meet at that particular hill, is that their individual graves form a square, like the 4 of them form 4 points of a square around that circle, around that hill. So that's pretty interesting, because they apparently were really good friends in life, and so now in death they still get together at that circle. So one of those 4 men, I wanted to point out how he died and how they memorialized him, because it's pretty interesting. So his name was Henry Montgomery. Apparently he was the founder and owner of 7 of the earliest cotton compresses in Memphis. He also founded the Montgomery racetrack. So apparently he suffered very, very harshly from stage fright during his life. And in his life, he was required to give speeches. So apparently at one point, one evening when he was supposed to give a speech, when he got up on stage, he stood there for a minute and then all of a sudden dropped dead. So people believe that he actually died of stage fright. Now that was back in, I think, the late 1800s. So nowadays we would probably, you know, say that he died of like a heart attack or something, not really dying of stage fright, but no doubt it might have been caused by his stress and anxiety. So the interesting thing about the monument at his grave, apparently the monument depicts him standing and with his arms out like he's about to give a speech. So they actually memorialized him in the final pose, if you will, that he was in before he dropped dead. So that's pretty interesting. I will try to find a picture of that and put it on the screen somewhere over here if I can find it. If not, then I couldn't find it. But nonetheless, that is a very interesting way to memorialize somebody. So apparently the cottage that I mentioned earlier that kind of serves as the offices at the cemetery, apparently that has its own ghost as well. I don't know if it was the same ghost that the director had experienced at one point that was whistling, but apparently this ghost isn't malicious or anything, but they've reported that the water faucet in the back of the building ends up getting turned on and off when nobody's been back there. So they think that there's this ghost that just keeps turning it on and off. So going back to Alice Mitchell, who murdered her lover, apparently her spirit does haunt Elmwood. It says in this book that there have been people who have taken pictures at her gravesite and seen orbs and things. I will try to see if I can find any pictures of that and put them over here. I wanted to go more into the backstory of what happened when she murdered her lover and then when she died. So I'm going to just read it from here because it's a lot of information, but I want to make sure I get it right. So apparently in January 1892, Alice Mitchell went down to the steamboat landing at the river, at the Mississippi River, to say goodbye to her friend Frederica, or Frida, Ward. Unbeknownst to anyone, Alice brought her father's shaving razor with her and slit Frida's throat on the cobblestones. At the murder trial, evidence was introduced that 19-year-old Alice and 17-year-old Frida had an unnatural relationship back then. And when Frida's sister insisted that the girls stop seeing each other, Alice became distraught. Apparently they interviewed some of her lawyers, and they said that Alice claimed, "I resolved to kill Frida because I loved her so much that I wanted her to die loving me. And when she did die, I know she loved me better than any other human being on earth." So apparently the jury ended up pronouncing her insane. So she was committed to a state mental hospital in Bolivar, Tennessee. So this is where it gets a little bit interesting about her death. Supposedly she died in the hospital in 1898. Records say that she died in the hospital of tuberculosis, but some people believe that she actually killed herself jumping into the water tower on the hospital's roof. So who knows what actually happened, but the fact that she kind of still possibly haunts the cemetery and maybe around the riverside, you know, it could be that she actually died a little more tragically than from tuberculosis, even though that is like an awful disease. But that is the end of today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it and stay tuned for... I hope you guys enjoyed it and stay tuned for the next one. Again, this is 31 Days of October, so I will have a new upload every single day of this month. So ring that bell if you want to know when I upload, or just check back here every day and see what I've got on here. I really appreciate you guys watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!